Unity has launched the campaign to try and counter the extremists.
Now speaking out to denounce terror and extremism.
30,000 people formed a human chain in the south this afternoon in the name of peace.
We're asking if religious intolerance is on the rise.
We believe that religious freedom is a fundamental human right.
Giving a message that Islam is a religion of peace.
We must all endeavor to spread love and a sense of community.
In the name of Allah, the gracious, the merciful, may the peace and blessings of Almighty Allah be upon you. Welcome to this, the 12th episode of Press Point. Today we are doing an annual review of 2013. It's 12 episodes since we began. This is of course our 12th. And we have three issues which we're looking at, which have been prominent over the last year. They have been, of course, terrorism and extremism has featured very heavily in the news. Secondly, persecution of religious minorities across the world, including Ahmadi Muslims. And then thirdly, war and peace, which has so tragically struck the world, particularly in light of the Middle Eastern conflicts within Syria, for example. So this is the annual review show. As ever, I'm joined by my very good friend and brother, Farooq Mahmood Sahab.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
Yes, today, of course, again, how do you see 2013 year? I mean, do you see as a year which is filled with war, terrorism and persecution, or do you see some bit of justice and peace as well in this year? You share with us your views, we share with the MTA's worldwide audience. We're always waiting for your feedback and your contribution because this is a live interactive show, and without this show, without you, this show is incomplete. Send your tweets using the hashtag PressPointMTA, or send us your emails at presspoint@mt.tv.
So in the studio, Brother Farooq, we have two familiar faces that we've been blessed to have with us throughout the year. So we thought it's only right that for the review show, we have back with us Amir Sahab Ghana. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah.
Wa alaikum salam.
Amir Sahab Ghana, of course, is the president of the Ahmadiyya community within Ghana, one of the most thriving communities across the world, and particularly within Africa. So a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you very much.
Also, Khalil Yusuf Sahab. Khalil, of course, is assistant secretary for the International Press Desk. So giving us a global perspective on what's happening across the world in relation to Islam and current affairs. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah, Khalil Sahab.
Wa alaikum salam.
And again, Brother Farooq, we're getting an international perspective because we've got Skype guests with us. So we've got Skype guests from America, the Russian desk, and also from Pakistan. So we should have a really interesting global perspective on today's show.
Absolutely.
So let's turn to part one, Farooq. As we know, terrorism and extremism has really been a prominent theme, not only for the people directly affected by the attacks, but I think anybody that watches the news. It's been a major issue which we've been focusing on. Within Press Point, back in May 2013, we looked at the Boston bombings. Then moving forwards in June 2013, we focused on the Woolwich attacks when drummer Brigadier Lee Rigby was tragically killed. And we'll get an update on this story now as well. And then in October 2013, there was the tragic attack in the Westgate Mall in Kenya. So we want to see how things have changed and have they improved or have they got worse across the world over the last year in 2013. Before we discuss in the studio, let's go to a video and take a look at to get a review and a summary of things that have happened this year. We are looking at the issue of extremism. How serious is this problem and why should we care about it?
This is a very sinister contemporary development and a sinister threat to global security.
Throughout the history, people have been perpetrating violence and extremism in the name of religion, whether it be in the name of Islam, Christianity, Judaism or Hinduism.
Within Islam there are many different people, there are many different thoughts, and extremism is a small minority and we should not judge based on that.
There is a real problem amongst some elements of the Muslim community that are genuinely radicalized.
There are groups who claim to be Muslims, who claim to follow a form of Islam which has no basis in Islam, which is a very radicalized form of Islam, which promotes terror, which promotes jihad as a violent extremism. Well, that has no basis in the true Islam 1400 years ago.
What we know about terrorism is they destroy the creation of Allah. The most important aspect of the creation of Allah is life.
Now we're joined here by Mr. Farhan Haq, who's the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon's associate spokesperson.
This isn't really not a problem isolated to any religion. In any religion, there can be the problem of extremist groups who use the religion to further their political agendas, and of course part of the danger is if those groups take to arms and use violence for the propagation of their aims.
What is the Muslim Ummah doing as an Ummah itself? A, to condemn the attacks, but B, to reform themselves too?
Jonathan, you talked about the killing of drummer Lee Rigby, of course, and things have developed for better, of course, ever since. Let's start with positive. Recently, in the last 3 or 4 days ago, the 2 guilty of Lee Rigby's murder have now been prosecuted. Of course, now they've been sent to the jail and for life, which is a good start because now justice has been seen. The person was killed. There's some closure to that problem. So that's the first story you can see on my screen. The second one is slightly heartbreaking for a Muslim because that's from far afield in New Zealand. The New Zealand Herald says that killer smiled, kissed the Quran as verdict was being read out. That story certainly is very, very heartbreaking for me as a Muslim because what story has gone out is not that this person was a one-off person or 2 people there, Michael Adebolajo and Michael Adeboale. But in reality, it's the Quran which is being, in a way, being made responsible for these acts of terror. That really sort of breaks Muslims' hearts, and also such story has gone so far away to New Zealand. Then we also covered, as you mentioned, in October month, the attack in Kenya by Al-Shabaab. Things haven't improved either over there, because again, a few days back, last week actually, they've launched another deadly terrorist attack in Kenya, which killed 5 people in a bus with 2 grenade attacks. Going forward again, another story is from CBS. In Canada, they've said a New York Police Department has reported to just 4 Al-Shabaab gunmen with AK-47 staged Kenya Westgate mall attacks. So now they've found only 4 people involved in killing 67 people there. So again, the same old story. Only a few people do the acts of terrorism, and in the end, the whole of name of Islam in reality is tarnished. And lastly, for the time being, I think something interesting, good statistics there. The Sydney Morning Herald in the World section have reported one of these studies that have been completed by one of the universities in America, a university of Maryland, of course, in Washington. It says over half of world's terrorism is confined to 3 countries. And unsurprisingly, they're Pakistan, Iraq and Afghanistan, with 54% of terror attacks have happened there, and 58% of the killings as a result have happened in those 3 countries. Followed very closely by the 5 countries, India, Nigeria, Somalia, Yemen and Thailand. Of course, recently we've again heard stories about what's happening in Somalia, Nigeria, again Boko Haram, and Thailand again, uprising. This morning the news was pretty as if things haven't changed for better. 15,400 people, record number, have been killed, and 8,400 terrorist attacks have taken place. These are the numbers from 2012, by the way. It took some time to collate the information and analyse this data. Therefore, it's a year late. But again, things haven't improved. One more thing that in those attacks, who are responsible? Taliban, Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda in Arabian Peninsula, Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, also Al-Shabaab. The last thing that I would like to read here, which is a comment by Joshua Keating, who's written this article. He says, I imagine the numbers of Shabaab and Boko Haram may have increased in 2013, but it's still worth noting that terrorism is both increasingly common in general, yet still extremely rare for the vast majority of the world. That's what we're saying. It's happening in small pockets of locations, but in reality the result is massively big.
Okay, so really interesting international perspective. I mean, Brother Khalil, when we're hearing this, then it is, I guess it's successful to the extent that it is quite a terrifying picture of terror across the world. Looking back at 2013, how much of an impact has terrorism had at an international level? How significant has it been, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, it's been very significant in some of the stories Farooq has mentioned today, but there's been terrorism across Africa. You've seen it in Syria, we've seen it in Libya, we've seen it in Nigeria, Kenya, Mali. You know, terrorism continues unabated across the world, and it's also right to say that terrorism is restricted to a few groups, and unfortunately some of those groups seem to associate that with Islam, despite the fact that Islam doesn't condone terrorism in any way, shape or form. Neither does it condone extremism, neither does it condone any killing. But it does have a very significant effect, because it's not just the fact that people are dying as a result of terrorism. In fact, it affects children, it affects economics, it affects society, it affects social justice, it affects the ability for people to do business in those countries, and that affects the predominantly poor people that occupy the countries that are most affected by terrorism. So terrorism continues to be a problem, and the way that it is to be resolved is for those countries that are dominant, that are powerful, to provide support to those smaller countries, to try and ensure that groups who harbour terrorist intentions, who seek to hijack the name of religion for their own political purposes, are simply not allowed to do so.
Okay, well, this is the key point. I mean, from Brother Killier, we're hearing that there is an onus on those countries within which terrorism is rife to themselves deal with the problem. But I guess the concern for many Muslims and non-Muslims alike will be that we look at Boston, we look at Kenya, we look at Woolwich, and these people are doing this in what they consider to be the name of Islam. This gentleman in the Woolwich attacks is kissing the Holy Quran. How is this happening? Why is this happening? Is this, let's ask the question the viewers might be thinking, is this part of Islam?
Yes,
is this 2013 terrorist incidents caused by Islam?
I believe it is a legitimate question to ask. The truth is, those who are acquainted with the teachings of the Holy Quran, as well as the traditions of the Holy Prophet of Islam, on whom be peace and blessings of Allah, will testify to the fact that there were prophecies that during the latter days, Islam would remain only in name, and the Quran would remain only in writing. Now, that is what is happening today, because otherwise, how come that the religion of Islam, the Holy Quran, as well as the traditions of the Holy Prophet of Islam, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, on whom be peace and blessings of Allah, condemn suicide, and yet suicide bombing has become the order of the day. Otherwise, how come that the Holy Quran is very emphatic on the point that if you kill one person, it will be as if you've killed the whole of mankind, and yet this is happening, and people think they are doing it in the name of Islam. This simply cannot be, if not for the fact that this is a fulfillment of prophecy. People have abandoned the teachings of the Quran, people have abandoned the teachings of the Holy Prophet of Islam, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and yet they claim to be doing these atrocious acts in the name of Islam. And that is the saddest aspect of it.
Yes, I mean this entirely seems to make sense in terms of the analysis. I mean it's still a great concern that Islam is being hijacked in this manner, and I think as we go throughout the show we'll hopefully be able to see a different perspective on Islam, which is being talked about by the president of the Ghanaian Jamaat. I know, Brother Farouk, we have the US, a brother from the US online. Yes. Perhaps we can get a perspective from the US.
Assalamu alaikum, Brother Haris Zafar, can you hear us?
Well, yes I can.
Assalamu alaikum, very loud and clear. How are you doing, sir?
Alhamdulillah, I'm doing very well, thank you.
Alhamdulillah. Okay, now we've talked about Boston bombing, of course, back in, was it month of May or June? It was May month, wasn't it? Yes. And of course, we had a show here on this very studio, on this very sofa. We discussed about this bombing, and again, ever since then, has the US public understood the real meaning of what Islam is all about, or things have worsened ever since?
It's actually kind of in between the two that you said. There was actually a survey that was published in the spring and after the May attack, and that survey found that that despite the heightened interest around radical Islam's connection to the Boston attacks, Americans' view of whether Islam is more likely than other religions to support violence remained close to what it's been for the past decade. So the ignorance about Islam and about what Muslims stand for certainly is still higher than Muslims here in America would like. But we didn't see a drastic increase due to the Boston attacks. It actually also found that the survey found that Muslims are viewed as the group that's most discriminated in the United States as compared to homosexuals, African Americans, Hispanics, and women. it's still found that the public knew that Muslims are being more discriminated than others. So yes, the view of Muslims is still skewed. There's been pros and cons. There's been good signs and bad signs over the past year or the past decade. But it seems like this year is not any different than any year prior.
Brother Harrison, just to, again, to almost play devil's advocate and ask you perhaps a difficult question. I mean, some of the viewers at home might be saying, well, we don't hear of Christian terrorist attacks, or we don't hear of Buddhist terrorist attacks. Why is it Islam that is, why are people doing this in the name of Islam? I mean, what would you tell the Americans that might be listening at home to try and explain this very puzzling and troubling picture that we see over 2013?
Well, it's a fantastic question. It's a fair question to ask. What I would tell them is that we have to admit as Muslims that there is a problem within the Muslim household. Threat not just to Muslims, but even to Muslims, as we've seen ourselves being victim to the persecution. But to understand that this is not a new phenomena of people using violence in the name of their religion. Sure, you have to go a little further back in history to see others, but even as Professor Robert Papp had found, suicide bombings were not even invented by Muslims. They're invented by the Tamil Tigers. And so we have to understand the larger scope of violence around the world to understand that, yes, this day and age, it feels like Muslims are at the forefront, although we still have the Christian militia groups across the world that are committing some atrocities, some very brutal, vicious activities that any humane person would condemn. So I think the biggest thing for us to explain is that this is happening. It's not specific to Islam, but to explain why we think it's going to happen. And Amir Saab had spoken about that. Theologically, we know why this is happening, according to the prophecy of the Prophet Muhammad, and we understand what the solution is and what the solution should be, which is the acceptance of that reformer that was meant to come, this divine guide, this Messiah who would come to reform Muslims, not Islam, to revive Islam and reform Muslims. And that's the message we take forward, is that that's the solution for the Muslim world.
Okay, thank you, Harris. We'll come back to you shortly. So thanks for clarifying that perhaps this is, in fact, it's very careful not to, in fact, associate directly Islam with terrorism, but in fact to recognise that there are much deeper causes, much deeper problems. Still a huge concern, but hopefully we'll see over the course of the show that there are voices within Islam that are very, very beautiful, very peaceful. Just before we move on to perhaps look at those voices in particular, I mean, looking back in 2013, Brother Khalil, has this been a good year or a bad year in relation to the war or the combating of world terror? And also perhaps what lessons have we learned from this year that we didn't know before about the shape, the face, the form of terror that's spreading across the world at the moment? What's your take on the past year?
And we've seen, for instance, over the course of the last 10 years, we've seen small terrorist groups that have carried out individual acts of terror, but 2013 has particularly seen terrorist groups now being involved in the destruction of a state, and Syria is a very good example of that, because what we've seen in Syria is a number of terrorist groups that have come together in order to some degree, to unite in order to destabilize that region. So from a terrorism perspective, I think we're seeing perhaps even a more sophisticated type of terrorism than we've seen before, and that's very negative. On the positive side, I think we've seen some very positive actions from Russia, for example, who in persuading the international community to accept a chemical weapons deal in which the weapons of President Bashar al-Assad were decommissioned and are still being decommissioned, averted perhaps international intervention into Syria, which more than likely would have caused a regional war and may well have resulted in a third world war. So from that perspective, I think we've seen something very positive as well, and President Vladimir Putin should certainly be commended for that. We would probably say he could have gone one step further and spoken a little bit more about the veto powers in the United Nations, which is one of the issues that really prevents global peace from being achieved, but certainly those are the the negatives and the positives.
Okay, the positives and negatives. Thank you, that's a very useful review. So I guess going back to this issue which we talked of a moment ago, which is Islam and terror, are the two synonymous? Now, of course, from all the guests we've heard that they're not, but I think it's very important perhaps for Farooq Saab to hear from this very interesting and powerful voice of the leader of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, who's been talking all around the world this year about this very issue. What sort of things have been said?
The same things for the last 4 to 5 years, actually, and the reality is the only one leader in the world right now who's consistently going to the world from east to west and west to east, and the same message of peace and love of Islam. Hazur's been to various countries, of course, this year. He went to America, Canada, Far East, to Japan, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, Japan. So, of course, one wonders that if the message is going out with that strength, and Allah Ta'ala is watching over us all, inshallah, hopefully, there'll be positive results. So Hazur has, if he was in Japan in November last month, he says about this very clearly that the suicide bombings and terrorist attacks were to be absolutely condemned, and that the Quran taught that the unlawful killing of one person was akin to killing all of mankind, as you mentioned beforehand as well. That's a clear message after these atrocities committed in different places in the world. Then again, Hazur was recently in Sydney, Australia as well, where, I beg your pardon, I need to go back, sorry. We're lucky. Okay, so in that case, Hazur again in Sydney, when he was sitting with a number of about 100-odd Australian dignitaries there, Hazur mentioned again very clearly that the Ahmadiyya Jamaat is a peace-loving community that acts entirely in accordance with the true teachings of Islam. It is a community that not only promotes peace, but whose every act and activity is conducted in an entirely peaceful manner. And again, Hazur was, another speech of Hazur's was in California, which was early this year in summer, in the month of May, again in Los Angeles, in Beverly Hills. Hazur said, there is no doubt that the acts of terrorism or extremism some so-called Muslims perpetrate have nothing whatsoever to do with the true teachings of Islam. The very meaning of Islam is peace, security, and giving a guarantee of protection against all forms of harm and evil. Amir Saab, it's a very clear message anyway, it's about peace. So why is that then other side of the story is very different? Of course, looking at those perpetrators of hate, they read the same Quran, but their interpretation is quite different.
The main difficulty is they don't read the Quran.
Right.
You see, if they were to read the Quran, they would know exactly what the teaching of the Quran is. These people do not read the Holy Quran, and that is why Hazrat Amirul Mu'mineen, the present Khalifa of this Ahmadiyya Muslim community, is appealing to people to read the Holy Quran. We have left the reading of the Quran to the mullahs, people who claim to be knowledgeable about Islam, but who do things that are completely inconsistent with the teachings of Islam. So whatever they say, that is what the people follow. They themselves don't read the Holy Quran to know the teaching by themselves. So when you follow people who themselves are ignorant, so an ignorant following an ignorant person, if you put the two together, what you get is, confusion and destruction. And that is what is happening today. People are not reading the Holy Quran. If they were to be reading it, they would not be doing the sort of things they do. That's my understanding.
It's in fact lack of education.
Lack of education.
Not only secular but spiritual itself. But I think this is good news in light of what we're looking at here, Amir Saab Ghana, which is the Caliph of Islam, the head of the community, the Ahmadiyya community, going across the world to provide this illumination, this knowledge. I mean, in light of this, Khalil, what sort of changes do you expect for 2014? I guess it's hard to predict and to forecast, but to some extent it would be nice to do that, to get a sense of what will happen over the current year in light of terror and extremism, but particularly perhaps governments listening and considering what are the best approaches, particularly in light of the guidance given by the head of the Ahmadiyya community across the world. What do you think is upcoming for us?
I'm glad you asked that question, because in New Zealand, when His Holiness was there at the end of one of the sessions, I remember that one of the reporters asked him, why is it that you think your message of Islam is going to be heard? Or how do you think our message of Islam is going to be perceived? A question that was similar to that. And the answer that His Holiness gave was because everybody who listens to our message cannot help but to be magnetized by the message of love for all, hatred for none. And I'm paraphrasing here, but that is actually a very important message. And what I hope for 2014
is that all of the significant effort that His Holiness has been doing this year and in the course of the last 10 years, because he's been Khalifa for 10 years now, is something that begins to resonate more and more with people. And I think that the venues at which he has spoken, the amount of coverage that he has received, the number of mosques that have been opened at which that peaceful message is being relayed, is going to make a difference and allow people to see that Islam is not what is represented in the media. So I think that's from a secular perspective. I also hope that non-Ahmadi Muslims also take heed of that message and seek to try and understand, as Amir Sahib has rightly said, what the message of Islam actually is. And the more they do that, the better the outlook for Islam. I mean, ultimately, there's no question Ahmadiyyat Islam is going to be successful. It's a matter of time. But I hope 2014 is a time where that process begins to increase in acceleration.
Okay, excellent. So it's a process of magnetization almost, of people being magnetically drawn, hopefully, to a much more beautiful, peaceful teaching and being alienated and repelled from hatred, from violence, from darkness, which is perhaps only natural that we'll begin to see this increasingly, according to our guests. So that's very interesting. Now, we can talk about this for the whole of the show almost, it's so important, but I think we have to move on to part two, which is to look at a very closely connected issue which stems from, I think, hatred and ignorance, which is persecution and abuse of religious minorities across the world. Looking back across the year, in February 2013, we did a focused show on this issue of religious freedom. We had the UN Special Rapporteur contribute, and we looked at how religious minorities were being treated and sadly abused in many places across the world. So let's recap on this. Brother Farooq, you've been doing some research and you've got some interesting updates for us in light of the year gone by.
Yes, a lot has happened, of course, persecution-wise. I think the country Pakistan has been the biggest culprit. Do you want to say something?
Well, yes, no, perfect. Yeah. Well, actually, before we go there, I think we've got a VT, which we can have a quick look at.
Let's watch it first. Probably will make more sense. Yeah, let's watch it first.
Today, we're looking at one simple question. Are religious freedoms at risk around the world? And if so, what can we do about it?
Part of the problem is, unfortunately, the rest of the Muslims, some of their conduct is contrary to the true teaching of Islam.
So we've been very lucky to have been able to interview essentially the world's expert on religious freedom, the UN Special Rapporteur on religious freedom.
We are faced with rising restrictions in many countries in the world, and I mean, of course, the world is a very complex phenomenon, but we see deteriorating trends in quite a number of countries in which minorities have been targeted.
Now, we've been lucky enough to have Knox Thames from the US Commission on International Religious Freedom.
You look at the Ahmadi community in Pakistan, it's basically an apartheid system where every element of their faith has been banned, and the government actively goes after them when cases are brought to their attention.
We're joined by Muhammad Hanif Sahib, the former head of the BBC Urdu service in London, a prolific writer and journalist. The Ahmadi situation has been ignored altogether by the Prime Minister?
Yeah, I think not just by him, but by everyone, including the media and including every single politician that you have in the country. The kind of persecution that you're seeing now, the levels of persecution that you're seeing now, are results of policies which were implemented 30, 35 years ago. So these things take sort of time. If you put in kind of bad discriminatory policies, you'll find out after 20, 30 years that what kind of society you've created, which is what we're seeing now.
Well, I think as far as Europe is concerned, firstly, the freedom of religion is defined in Article 9 of the Human Rights Act, and that gives freedom of expression, of conscience, of religion to all the people living within Europe.
Let me go and build upon this with Qamar Suleiman Sahib.
No, the problem is not with minority, it is the problem all over Pakistan with the whole society.
Why is it that Ghana's doing so well in religious freedom? What's the key to success?
As I said, the Constitution guarantees freedom. And all governments, even though the presidents have been Christians, all governments in this country have respected the freedom to worship in any way a person likes within the Constitution.
This is truly a sorry state, of course, in Pakistan. Things haven't improved ever since. We've discussed this back in February. Now, if anything, things have worsened for Ahmadis in that country. I've got one of the stories there from Telegraph that says British doctor in Pakistan arrested for reading from Quran. Two problems with that. One is a doctor. Secondly, reading from Quran means he is in the prison for that reason. And this person is 72 years old, an old man who is a British citizen. But again, he's in the prison for no reason, but the reason being, from the Constitution point of view, he's an Ahmadi Muslim. The 74 Constitution very clearly, in the Second Amendment, made us out of the pale of Islam. Then 84 Ordinance came along of Ziaul Haq, made things even more difficult. Effectively, being a Muslim, Ahmadi Muslim in Pakistan, and practicing a faith is impossible in present day and age. Similar story again we've got up there, which is the Express Tribune in Pakistan reports Ahmadi persecution. Police bow to clerics to tear down minarets. So police is in fact taking the first step of tearing down the minarets of a mosque. They are supposed to be the law enforcement agencies and saving and securing people's rights and freedoms and their property. They do quite the other way around. It says police demolished minarets at an Ahmadi place of worship in Sialkot after a group of protesters threatened to do themselves. So police says, why can't we take the honours with ourselves? And lastly, before we move on, from International Press Desk, they've published some data of the month of September, for example. We won't look at the numbers, but we'll just look at the kinds of persecution and acts of terror against Ahmadis that have been perpetrated. Things like anti-Ahmadiyya media reports, attacks on mosques and properties of Ahmadis, kidnaps and serious violent attacks. Cultural violence means things like boycotts and things like that, of course, in social life, even shopkeepers refusing to serve Ahmadi customers, threats including death threats to Ahmadis, employment and education-based discrimination at work, universities, colleges, an anti-Ahmadiyya hate campaign and conferences are rife in Pakistan right now.
Okay. So this is clearly a very concerning state. I think the pie chart is particularly concerning. You see so many diverse forms of hatred. What is the current situation for minorities in Southeast Asia, Brother Khalil? What's looking back over 2013? Have we got better? Have we got worse? What's it looking like across the region?
There's no question they haven't got better, and in many cases they've got worse. In Karachi, in Pakistan, we had 3 members of the same family, the Kiani family, that were all murdered as a result of being Ahmadi Muslims. And I'm really pleased that you highlighted that chart, because that shows the breadth of persecution that is suffered by Ahmadis in Pakistan. It is in every single aspect of their lives, right through from admission in education, in which there are anti-Ahmadiyya curricula, all the way through to the point at which they die. They're unable to be buried in peace because police officers, along with religious clerics, seek to exhume those bodies because the headstones contain Quranic inscriptions. And all the way through that, Ahmadis suffer social violence, they suffer physical violence, they are subjected to death threats. In many cases, Ahmadis are murdered. Hundreds of Ahmadi Muslims have been murdered. In addition to that, lists of Ahmadis are published and distributed so that they are targeted at homes and employment. It is not possible to underestimate the level of persecution that Ahmadi Muslims face in Pakistan, and it isn't limited to Pakistan. This has been going on now since 1974. And before that, and since 1984, there's been legislation in place, and there are efforts now to export that legislation. Fortunately, countries like Bangladesh are very bravely resisting that. But Indonesia has regional laws which seek to prevent Ahmadi Muslims from practicing their faith. And there are other countries in Asia and in Central Europe, as our brothers will talk about, I hope, later on in this program, in which Ahmadi Muslims are suffering persecution, and other minorities as well. And I would just add one last point, and it is this. When you deny the religious freedom of minorities and you seek to work away at that fundamental human right, other human rights also follow. So this is a gradual, slippery slope in which you don't just find religious freedoms being affected, the right to justice, the right to education, the right to freedom of expression, the right to freedom of the press, all of those rights which you would normally expect also suffer the same erosion because society feels it's acceptable to take away people's rights just because of who they are. In fact, it absolutely isn't acceptable, and there is nothing Islamic about that at all.
So it's a comprehensive picture, really, of abuse and of hatred and of persecution within Pakistan and across the region. So let's go now to the heart of where these things are taking place, to Pakistan. We have Advocate Mujib Rahman on the line with us. Of course, Advocate Mujib Rahman has himself actually been a lawyer in many of the legal cases to challenge many of these persecution laws, so it's quite an honour to have him online with us. I'm going to ask you a question that perhaps somebody that is not familiar with these issues might ask. In the studio, we're hearing the guest, Mujib Rahman, tell us that these are the terrible things that are happening. Maybe the guests at home, the viewers at home might be thinking, well, surely these Ahmadi Muslims have done something to deserve this. Surely it wouldn't just be the case that these people are being persecuted for no reason. What is the crime of being an Ahmadi Muslim in Pakistan? Why are these people being treated in this manner? Are they doing something wrong and they're committing criminal offences? What's going on? Why is the abuse so great?
Hello?
Are you with us? Yes.
Yeah, Jonathan.
Yeah, so just to recap on that question then. So the question I'm asking here is that to somebody who's never come across this issue of essentially apartheid and of persecution within Pakistan, why is this happening? Are Ahmadi Muslims doing something wrong? Are they guilty of acts of abuse themselves? What's happening in Pakistan that is causing such vitriol to be poured upon the Ahmadi Muslim community?
You see, in Pakistan, the situation of Ahmadis is strikingly different from all other minorities and the persecuted groups. The persecution of Ahmadis and the denial of human rights for Ahmadis is institutionalized and is sanctioned by law of the land. And the law of the land sanctions that there is a law which is the basis of all this persecution. The law in itself is bad enough, but the law enforcing agencies stretch the law beyond all reasonable limits. And now the stage has come where the police and the administration, and I say it with full sense of responsibility, that the police and the government administration act in liaison to hound Ahmadis everywhere and create different kinds of situations and cases against them. All human rights enumerated in the civil and political covenant are being denied. The right to life and liberty is denied. The freedom of conscience is denied. Places of worship and access to places of worship is denied. The freedom of assembly is denied. For last 25 years, we have not had an assembly in Rabwa, not even the sports rallies. So freedom of assembly, freedom of sports and culture, freedom of religion, everything has been denied. And each incident, you have talked of many incidents already, but each incident has been reported to the government authorities and no action is taken. So I say that it is being done because, my final word,
jump in if I may.
It is because the state has abdicated its right under the pressure of the mullah.
Yes, can I just jump in if I may? I mean, what about 2013 then? I think that's a very useful context. What about this year? You're in Pakistan. You'll be part of that community within which you can see these acts taking place. Have we seen improvements or have we seen retrogression? What's the situation like on the ground?
You see, the 2013 has been a year of relentless, unmitigated violation of human rights and persecution of Ahmadis. The police and administration, I said, act in liaison. And then again, since Ahmadis would not violate law, even at a very high emotional cost, they obey the law. The mullahs and the extremists have adopted another strategy. Now, the vigilante groups deploy decoys to go to the houses of Ahmadis and workplaces and From there, they call the emergency police, and a search is carried out inside the houses to find out if there is any literature. Whether they find any literature or not.
Advocate Mujib Rahman, sorry to interrupt. So what we're going to do quickly is we're going to get a quick view from across the world. We'll hopefully be able to come back to you again because we want to hear more about this. But now we're just actually going to go to another of different regions across the world. But before we do that, I think, Brother Farouk, some of the viewers at home want to tell us some news and tell us some messages.
It's very ironic that on the 10th of December there was Human Rights Day and Pakistan celebrated it. There's a couple of tweets about that. One tweet is from Atif S. Ahmed. He says Pakistanis are celebrating the Human Rights Day but ignore the black laws and state-sanctioned persecution of Ahmadis. Then here is, I think probably do, Bilal Mahmood says hypocrisy of mullahs who say from their tongues Muslims for peace, but then encourage persecution of Islam Ahmadiyya in their own countries. If you go to Twitter now, you'll realize there's a lot of mullahs even saying the same thing, the peace, we are peace-loving Muslims. But in reality, who speaks with Ahmadis, that is something which is questionable. Let's move on to perhaps America.
Let's take a look. Well, just an important region of the world that we need to take a look at is what's often forgotten is that after the Cold War, of course, many states within the ex-Soviet bloc became free states. And within these states, it'd be very interesting to go there now and to find out what is happening from our Skype guest, who is, of course, Nurum Taybek. So, Assalamu alaikum to Nurum Taybek. Can you tell us, in the ex-Soviet bloc, in countries such as Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and many of these other countries, what's the situation like there for religious minorities? Has 2013 seen progress, or has it seen backtracking of religious freedom?
Walaikum assalam. Thank you very much. Basically, 2013 and the previous year have brought actually less freedom of religion, along with other human rights and freedoms. And I personally, having studied economy, and politics, see the main reason for the increase in restriction of religious freedom is the desire to legalize and perpetuate the current status quo of the greatest injustice ever happening in the history of the humankind before our very eyes, of which observers have been telling every day. And this injustice has been spreading in former socialist countries over the last 22 years. Previously, all the property in most of these countries was considered as belonging to all the people collectively. But after the fall of the socialist world, most of the property became property of very few people. And the capitalist world openly admitted it was behind ruining this socialist system. Actually, over time, the capitalist world has been gradually gaining even more benefit from this process through its subtle instruments, which are unknown to most of the new capitalist elite in the former socialist world, like usury. Few bother to read the book by Miss Margaret Kennedy, etc. This greatest injustice in economy has been called in the Holy Quran as the greatest factor of causing instability in all spheres of human activities. And of course, its exponential and spiraling effect cannot be kept under control, so it has been subduing and enslaving whole nations, including Western ones, causing crisis and destroying peace in all sorts of human rights and freedoms, about which our current spiritual leader has been saying. So therefore, I see this as a part of overall process of crisis caused by all the, unfortunately, weak sides of the current system in the world. Thank you.
Yes, so Nurum, Brother Nurum, we know also that in a lot of these nations, sadly, religious minorities are actually having their registration removed, so their very right to exist as a religion, for people to come to them and join them as a religion, to practice their religions, has been denied. What's been happening in 2013 in this regard? Have we seen positive steps? And if not, what's the cause behind this?
Well, basically, whatever change happening is only to the worse. And if we took just 5 Central Asian countries, 2, or I should rather say 3 of them never had proper religious rights, like Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and partially Tajikistan. So they did not allow others to register at all. Whereas Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan were more open, but still over the last few years, they changed their policy completely, and therefore unfortunately, the situation is coming back in a way to Soviet time totalitarianism. And the main reason is the overall crisis, global crisis, which makes them to cover their faults. Therefore, they deny the freedom of voice, expression. So actually, they have subdued all other types of rights and freedoms. And of course, they are all interrelated, all the rights and freedoms. Therefore, they cannot allow full freedom of religion either, because the freedom of religion is speaking about the equality of people, their brotherhood, etc. And this comes contrary to their contemporary understanding.
Nurum Taybek, thank you so much for giving us this insight. So I think from what Mr. Taybek is telling us, that essentially religious persecution is not, sadly, limited to any geographic location. It's not simply limited to Pakistan, as Amir Sahib has told us. It's not simply limited to Indonesia and Malaysia, but in fact this toxin, this cancer, if we can call it, is actually spreading, sadly, across even the Balkan states. The ex-Soviet states are now experiencing this as well. Now, so this is part two that we've looked at here, this is persecution. But I think really, again, sadly, a key issue which we need to look at in this show is war, the issue of war, and hopefully of peace as well, in terms of a positive change. So let's start off in the studio. I know with Amir Sahib Ghana, with yourself, looking over the year, we've seen a lot of tragic situations developing in the Middle East. We've seen the situation of Syria worsen greatly. Looking back over the year, have world powers, do you feel, done enough themselves to prevent the outbreak of war? Are they themselves acting positively to create peace and harmony in that region, and I guess really which is globally in terms of the implications of these conflicts? So are they doing enough, would you say, Ms. Afghana?
Thank you very much. Before I come to that, I would like to say that because of what Brother Khalil had said, and also the contribution by Brother Mujibur Rahman, there was a time I used the term religious apartheid for Pakistan. And the then High Commissioner of Pakistan in Ghana took exception of it, but I insisted that it was true. Because if you go to South Africa during those days of apartheid, this obnoxious law was responsible for a lot of atrocities that had been committed against the blacks and the colored in South Africa. And that's exactly what is happening in Pakistan. The only difference is here they are talking of religion. But as Brother Khalil said, the moment you deny anybody freedom of religion, all the other freedoms are also denied. So much so that freedom of life is denied, and freedom even of burial is denied in death. Now that definitely is religious apartheid, and this is something that should not be tolerated by anybody in the world. And just as apartheid was kicked off in South Africa, that is how the whole world should unite to kick off any religious apartheid that shows its ugly head anywhere in the world, because that is so atrocious against the nature that God had created a person with. Now, having said that, I will say that the world leaders, he has already mentioned one of them, who has tried as much as possible, not, I mean, with the whole of the effort, but at least made an effort to mitigate, the possibility of world war. But otherwise, what we feel is it is important that all the world leaders should speak with one voice when it comes to avoidance of world war. The head of our community, Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmed, who is the Khalifa al-Masih V, has traveled across the world, like it has already been said. He's been to the United States, he's been to New Zealand, he's been to Australia, he's been to, the British Parliament, he's gone to Germany, he's gone to the headquarters of the European Union. Everywhere he's been talking about making an effort to avoid world war. And he has also written to almost all the world leaders of to explain to them how important it is to avoid world war. Because the moment we go to this world war, God forbid, then all our civilization, all our culture, all the scientific progress technological advancement, everything will then be wiped off. So it is important that those who have influence in the world should use their influence to try to speak one voice when it comes to avoidance of world war. When they do that, then if God permits, we'll be able to avoid it. Otherwise, all the effort that mankind has made until today will come to nothing.
This is a very stark and striking warning, which I think really resonates and very much captures the feeling of the previous year. I think everybody has really been on the edge of their seats, asking themselves whether now will in fact be the point at which nuclear war might begin. And this may seem shocking to some of the viewers, but I think a deeper analysis in fact shows this is the case. So just to get a sense of why Amir Sabghana is telling us this, let's take a look at a video which gives a sense of what's happened over the last year in terms of war and peace and these situations which have developed. Let's go there now. And we're asking the simple question of, is the world facing a global catastrophe in terms of a nuclear thermal war, in terms of World War III?
There are economic similarities, there are political similarities, there's an ideological threat. So if you look at all these different variables that led to conflicts in the past, major wars, a lot of those variables we see them now on the horizons, and they're really a serious concern.
Really, there's nations are betraying their contractual commitments, their trade commitments, various treaties. There's issues of perfidy, treachery. These are what are causing the unrest and global instability. You know, there's another really salient and important factor here as well, and that is access to justice. There is, of course, injustice as between nations, but there's also an issue of injustice within nations.
How can we stop this world from going into what appears to be now an inevitable disaster?
I think that the people have to speak up and take a stand and say no more to war, and that we have our own problems to consider and no one else's.
What Islam can offer to the world and to the Arab nations in order to bring about peace and harmony within this region.
God in the Holy Quran, as well as the Holy Prophet in his sayings, they mentioned very clear, any dispute between the Muslims or any fight, it should be solved or resolved just between the Muslim nations.
What are the risks of Western powers in becoming involved in the Syrian conflict and within the Arab region as a whole?
The risk is not just a perception of U.S. yet again looking to engage in another imperialistic war, but the bigger risk is of this conflict escalating into a third world war. So that has been repeatedly said.
Actually, Islam is asking us to discharge the rights of others and to concentrate on discharging the rights of others and to be just to others.
Okay, so let's go over to one of the world's, well, perhaps the world's leading superpower still at this age, the United States of America. We have a brother with us that's been a regular guest on our show, Brother Quddus. Let me come over to you. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum assalam.
So let's just for those viewers who haven't perhaps been able to watch some of our earlier shows on these issues of war, the tragedy of international conflict, why are we talking about a potential World War III situation now at this time? What is the context and the various factors at play that make this such a volatile situation over the last year of 2013?
I think that anybody that's been watching your show, I think they can very easily see how the world has been devolving into chaos and political instability. There is really no region. I mean, you can start from West Africa all the way through East Asia, and there is civil war, there is strife, there are injustices that are being committed by one on the other. The Arab Spring started off, and some people had a lot of misplaced hope in it. But even at that time, Hazrat Khalifatul Masih had very clearly said that Islam does not teach that there is a path towards peace through chaos and social unrest, and I think that politically, the world has come to a point where people have talked about this now for a while, all the ingredients of a world war are there. If you look at the world before the First World War or before the Second World War, and if you compare what's going on today, I think anybody can see just by looking at the newspapers that this is unless countries and superpowers, all countries, the burden is not just on the superpowers, until people reverse course and start dealing with each other in terms of justice, not looking at their own national interest or not looking at their interest in the outcome. There are so many different flashpoints. Syria is the most obvious one, and Hazrat Khalifatul Masih has talked about this, and he's been talking about this, more than 5 or 6 years now, at least with reference to Syria. So I think it's very, very important that Russia has, as Khalil Bhai mentioned, Russia has taken a very good step, but just in the last few days, I think there's a lot more friction now than there was 2 months ago over the issues of inspection and compliance. So it still continues to be a very, very dangerous situation.
Excellent. Thank you, Quddus, for giving us this essentially an annual roundup of the year in just a few minutes. So that's an excellent job. Thank you very much. Brother Farooq, I mean, I know you again, great research you've been doing online, and the Caliph of Islam has been talking in Japan recently. Now this is very interesting because I guess one of the nations that perhaps suffered the very worst atrocities in World War II is Japan, of course, with Hiroshima and the location of the world's only nuclear bomb. What was said?
Because I'm very short. Yes, Azur's made speeches all around. I mean, America, Canada, Japan, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand. I've picked one up because time is very short now. Yes. In particular, from when Azur opened the Khilafah Centenary Hall in Sydney. Yes. It was in October month. And that has been shown on MTA yesterday, actually. And something amazing for me personally was an eye-opener, what Azur said. Azur talked about the importance of Khilafat, as a matter of fact. Azur said all of the Khalifas who have led the Ahmadiyya Muslim community have always advocated for peace, unity and a sense of mutual brotherhood. That's not in the press release, but Azur said in that speech that Azur referred to chapter 24, verse 56 of Holy Quran, Surah Nur. And he said in his view, that in present day and age as well, that the state of fear will be converted to peace through Khilafat. So if you listen to Khalifa and pay heed to his words, even if you're an Ahmadi or non-Ahmadi Muslim, or non-Ahmadi Muslim or non-Muslim, whatever, then certainly Allah will actually convert your fear into peace. And as Azur said, that the second Khalifa, Hazrat Muslim Maud, Hazrat Mirza Bashiruddin Mahmud Ahmad, he had prophesied after the First World War, the League of Nations will disintegrate. It did so. In 1990, Azur said, the fourth Khalifa, Mirza Tahir Ahmad, Rahimahullah Ta'ala, he also prophesied that Iraq war could become such a huge thing that the whole world would be engulfed. It happened. But Azur said, now I'm telling the world, and been telling for the last 4 to 5 years, then mind your ways, otherwise you're heading towards massive destruction. And I've paraphrased it.
Thank you very much for the paraphrase. That's very valuable. Brother Khalil, you've already told us today about this situation where the Caliph of Islam was very clearly warning about the stark dangers within Syria. And of course, the letter was written by the Caliph of Islam to President Putin to say congratulations and well done for acting in this way which promoted peace. But looking ahead at 2014, are we still on the precipice, really, of a potential Third World War? And what can the world's superpowers do in order to drag and bring the world back away from this course of destruction, particularly in light of the Khalifa's guidance?
It's a good question, actually, and it requires much more time than we have. I think we've probably got about a minute left.
That's
so
right.
Let me just pick on one thing. Great. And that is that one of the phrases that Hazur Akhtas has been using in his speeches is that you cannot have peace without justice. That is a very simple but also highly complex phrase. And what it means is that nations must fulfill the rights of the people and act with justice. And the people must also fulfill the rights of the nation. That means being loyal to their nation in everything that they ask, except
as in Pakistan, for instance, they ask us not to do our namaz and visit mosques. I mean, we'll never be obedient to that. But in other things, as long as it doesn't contravene God's divine law, you should be obedient to the state in which you are in. And so I would say that in order to secure peace, those two elements are absolutely important for all nations. I'm sorry, I haven't got time to go into more detail than that.
Relationship of rights and responsibilities
Absolutely.
is key.
Yes.
Samir Sabghana, I think we have perhaps 30 seconds, but if you could forecast for 2014, how should the world manage itself, the world leaders, to prevent the catastrophe of Third World War in 2014?
I would agree with the idea that they must act with one voice. The second thing is, as he said, you cannot talk of peace without justice. And Hazrat Khalifa al-Masih had given the same message to the African continent during the Pan-African event that took place only a few weeks ago. And because of the importance of that message, it has been given very, very wide publicity in Ghana. The Ghanaian Times has published it with his photograph. The Graphic has published it with his photograph. It has been discussed on TV. It has been discussed on radio very, very widely. Because look, this is the time that we have to be very, very careful about what we do, wherever we might be, whether we are in Europe or Africa or Asia. It's now a global village. And whatever happens in one country can affect all others. And in Africa, we are not taking these things lightly. And that's why I'm so happy that in Ghana, they have given it very, very wide publicity. And it is so significant that Huzur had made the same point, that you cannot talk of peace without justice. We have to deal with the people of the country.
Ms. Sabghana, I think time is up for today, but I think we're going to have you back on in 2014, God willing, if we can be blessed with that.
Thank you very much.
But if I can just take Amir Sabghana's point there, the key point, I think, for the viewers at home, and particularly if we have power holders listening, there can be no peace without justice. So let us not attempt to attain peace until we take true recognition of the principle of justice. The two are interconnected. And again, for the viewers, let us pray that 2014 can bring this year of peace. And I think a lot of effort is needed in that regard. So we look forward to seeing you in the new year. Until then, please remember the team and all of the Press Point team in your prayers. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May the peace and blessings of Allah be upon you.
Peaceful 2014.
He has launched the campaign to try and counter the extremists.
Now speaking out to denounce terror and extremism.
30,000 people formed a human chain in the south this afternoon in the name of peace.
We're asking if religious intolerance is on the rise.
We believe that religious freedom is a fundamental human right.
Giving a message that Islam is a religion of peace.
We must all endeavor to spread love and a sense of community.